My name is Dane Scott. I'm the new director of the Center for Ethics. And we're very pleased to have Mike Kadas here, who got a degree in philosophy, which I really like, and economics. And the mayor is going to talk about the just, sustainable Missoula.
Thanks, Dane. Thank you. I'm impressed by the number of non-traditional students at the university these days. No, I have the pleasure of being on the board for the Practical Ethics Center, and this is one of the programs that the board has encouraged, and particularly as an effort to tie the university back into the community and vice versa. And so it's great to see so many people from the community here, as well as students. And for those of you who are students, you have some real stalwarts in the community who are here today, and they know a lot more about this than I do. So that's one of the reasons for the title. The key word in the title of this, well, there are a number of key words, obviously just, sustainable. I don't know if we got community in there, that would be a key word, but really the most important word is dialogue. And that means that you participate in this conversation as well as I do. So I'm encouraging you to interrupt, rebut, comment, throw in your 2 cents worth as we go through this. This is really ultimately a huge topic. It's not something you can kind of, we can go a lot of different places with it, and I'm open to doing that. But to get the conversation started, I thought I would start with something that we're familiar with and is a huge topic for us as well. But to try to think about a just and sustainable community around and within the context of growth, because that's what we wrestle with here in Missoula so much, at least on the political end of things. And how do you make, well, first of all, are those notions good? And you know, one of the points of the talk is to try to flesh out the nuances of kind of how they might make our lives difficult, particularly then in the context of growth. But if they are good, then how do you achieve them as a goal? And that's not, at least from my perspective, I haven't seen a lot of formulas that get you there. It's an iterative process, and you never get there. It's always kind of that goal in the distance, the mirage that you chase after. Hopefully it's not a mirage. So I want to start kind of and just lay what I see as the framework locally. This is a map we created a couple of years ago to try to help us think about growth in Missoula. And what we've done on the map is we've using a scale here and shading, shaded in the various densities, currently built densities in our community. Then we've also, with purple, included commercial and industrial areas. All the browns are residential primarily, but the darker the brown, the higher the density. And actually, you know, we didn't get the university, but it would be very brown as well. And you can see here, we actually go from about 12 dwelling units per acre all the way down to 0. But the point is to have a sense of kind of where things are now. And then the other really kind of big dominant color here is green, obviously. And green usually denotes parklands. It doesn't in this case. There are some parklands, but it denotes places that can't be built upon without some kind of major policy change. So it's it's places that are have a legal designation, such as Forest Service, or city open space, or Fish, Wildlife, and Parks land. And then the other are things that have a geographical restriction, such as floodplains or steep slopes. Any slope that's over 25 degrees, we essentially, through our zoning and subdivision ordinances, we don't allow to be built on now anyway. So just because it creates a whole rash of problems. So the idea here is, well, let's have a sense of kind of what the existing level of development is, and then how we would grow and where we would do it. And then we figured out if you're using current population growth statistics, and it's interesting, you look at population growth in Missoula up through 2000, 22% over one decade, 26%, 30%, 30%, 4% in the 80s, and then back up to 22%. That's a pretty powerful history of growth in our community. If we were to extrapolate then over 30 years, for this area, what that would mean is that we'd have to have 25,000 new houses. And so that's a pretty big jump in the total number of new houses. And what we did then was, well, if we were going to build that many houses, let's turn this into a little bit of a contest because we all like to play games. We've sized the map, and then we sized these chips so that each chip covers 40 acres. Okay? And so if you assigned a chip to 1 dwelling unit per acre, then you need 40 divided into 25,000, and that equals 632 chips. And so if you want to figure out where to put all the projected population that we expect to see happen in this valley in the next 30 years, you've got to find a place for each of these 632 chips. And what you learn really quick is that you have to stack them. So that's one of the tensions here, is, how do we deal with population growth? And just a piece of this is we have a tendency to look at population growth as them, the other, someone else. And there was I read it I've known it for a while, but I read it again. It was just reinforced by Paul Polson, whose office is just down here. And based on recent population statistics, the in-migration to Missoula is almost exactly identical to the out-migration. So where is the 2% per year population growth coming from? And guess what, folks? It's the old comic book, but we are the enemy, okay? It's us. It's our children, of all things. Now, I think that puts a little different perspective. It's a lot easier to kind of rag on Californians, for ruining our place, or Washingtonians, or whoever. Maybe it's the Mexicans. But when it's your own children, that's a little harder. And so now the question, and this kind of gets us back to justice and sustainability, is do we have an obligation to create living places, homes, for our children? I think that's really kind of the question that we're wrestling with. And we want to kind of get that mixed up with, do we have an obligation to create housing for Californians and those people who keep coming here? I want to argue that we do, and that we're kind of a place that we are welcoming, and we see that as an advantage to our community. That adds diversity, that enriches our lives when we have people from other places. But even if you don't like that, if you want to kind of keep the Californians out, you still got to deal with this issue of our own children. Where are we going to put them? So I think that this growth rate, based on this, I think it's here to stay. And I can think of one way. There's a couple of ways we could stop it. One way is we could try to do what Boulder did. And what they did was, they did a couple of things. One good thing they did is they bought up all the land that they didn't want to see developed and turned it into open space. But another thing they did is they said, we are not going to allow this community to grow by any more than 1% a year, and we're going to force that by the number of building permits that we allow. And they did it. Now the problem with that is economics. And kind of go over here. This is Missoula, kind of, but it works. It's actually, as I'll go through this, it works for Boulder pretty well. Now, there's a reason for the shape of these curves, but this is the housing, big picture kind of housing supply. So this is rentals and home ownership and everything all mixed together. The housing supply in the 80s, if you remember that time period, this is back when growth was 4%, there were a lot of houses that were pretty underutilized. And a fairly high vacancy rate because all the mills had shut down and people, this wasn't as great a place to live. Some would argue, some of us who came in this time period thought it was really neat, because the rent was cheap and they still had all these nice things. But anyway, what happened then over the 80s, so here's the demand curve, and we had a price of this. And beginning in the late 80s, we started kind of becoming a popular place. And so people started moving here, and so this demand curve started moving out like this. And at first, there were no significant price increases because there was all this extra housing stock that was still largely underutilized. Boarded up windows, that sort of thing. And so as demand increases, people start making those incremental investments in housing, and they start they make that stock more valuable. Until at some point, all of that old stock can't be improved upon. And then you end up with a really sharp curve because now, in order to increase the housing stock, you actually have to go out and build new houses. And you can't do that very well in the short term. That's kind of a medium term and long term type of thing because it takes you, at least a week or two to get through the building code process or the zoning process and getting your financing lined up, with the bank. That might be another week or two, and then you've got to build it and finding a carpenter. And believe me, in this time period, because in the 70s, remember what happened? We had this big housing boom, and we had all these spec builders, and interest rates in the late 70s went through the roof, and all those spec builders died. And what happened was there was this infrastructure, this economic infrastructure that was there to build houses. And all of a sudden they all left because they lost everything. And so recreating that infrastructure was really difficult. It takes time to do that. Having been burned back in the 70s, a lot of these guys maybe are still around doing a few custom houses now and then. But they're not taking a lot of risks. I mean, they essentially find someone who wants to build a house. That person signs a contract. It's usually cost plus, and we'll build this house. It's not this. Well, we're going to buy 40 acres of land, and we're going to build 300 houses on that 40 acres of land, and we're going to see if we can't sell them. That isn't going on anymore. The infrastructure that allows that, the private infrastructure that allows that to happen is gone. And so it takes time for that to get recreated. And that's essentially the infrastructure that puts lots of houses on the market that is able to move this line out here. And it took time for that to happen. I think that that's recreated itself. And of course, now they all have their enemies as well from all the evil things they do in communities. But anyway, what happens then, clearly, as demand, this is kind of the 2% of people that are keep coming here. If you don't move this line, if you don't find ways to move that supply line out, the only consequence that's going to happen is this intersection is going to keep going up, and the price is going to go up rapidly because this is such a steep line. And that's what we've experienced, for 15 years. And that's what happened to Boulder, too. I mean, the median sales price in Boulder is probably over $300,000 a year. In Missoula, it's $185,000 a year. Now, back in 1990, it was $65,000, okay? You could buy, an average house cost you $65,000. So it's almost tripled in 15 years. Pretty radical. That will have an impact on things, and it might have an impact on this notion of livability. It also might have an impact on density. So, as a community, how do we respond to the increase in in the number of people coming. And clearly, one of the things we have to do is figure out how to build more houses. Or we make the choice and say, no, we don't want things to change that much. We really like our big backyards, and by God, we're willing to pay for them. Because if you don't do this, then what you're going to get is this. You're going to get higher prices. If you don't increase supply, you're going to get higher prices. Now, no place does just one of anything. You know, it's always a combination. And that's what's happened in Boulder, too. So Boulder has changed in some interesting ways. They bought all the open space to kind of do livability. They restricted growth, and that had an impact on price. And they encouraged density. And by encouraging density, they put in more dwelling units in this area, if this were Boulder. And that then has an effect on livability. And a lot of people argue it's negative, because more density means more neighbors, means more conflicts, means less privacy, means more pollution, means more traffic, all those things, okay? But if you don't do something like that, it means your kids have to go live in Longmont or Clinton if they want to stay close, or Arkansas if that's where the jobs are. And you know, that's kind of one of the fundamental questions for us as a community is, well, are we going to actively make spaces for our kids, or to make the question a little more difficult, are we going to actively make space for people who decide to come here and live? And if we don't, then we're going to see this change. And I guess one of the consequences of this change is this has some pretty interesting effects on livability too. If the median sales price of all your new homes is $250,000, what kinds of people are going to live in your community? It won't be people just out of college. You know, they can't afford that. They can't even begin to afford that. It probably won't be your children, because they can't afford that either, unless you have done so well selling your own house or the rental that you had that you can afford to endow them with a place to live. But either way, this gets impacted. I mean, we can change the character of our neighborhoods by doing nothing, because, or by requiring nothing be done, by freezing supply, because the price is going to continue to go up. People are not going to decide to go away. And that was, let me just go back. There is one other way to solve this problem. It's a little ugly, but it works. And that's, you know, this demand kind of keeps marching out here. And why is that? Well, that's because we're a pretty nice place to live. People see this place and they say, oh, you know, they go through on vacation and it's like, I could live here. And they make the choice to pull up roots and come live here. And our kids, you know, initially they're in high school and they think, I can't wait to get out of here. But, and I'm obviously generalizing, they go out and live in the world for a little while and then they say, whoa, that wasn't such a bad place. I think, you know, it's a good thing I get to visit in Christmas and Thanksgiving and summer in particular. Maybe I'll move back. You know, I have 2 young kids and I'd like them to grow up the same way I did. Well, the other way of solving this problem is to affect demand. Now, the way you affect demand is you make the place undesirable. Let's just make it kind of butt ugly. And that'll hold housing prices down. And we'll be able to kind of get back to the way we were. None of us are really very comfortable with that solution, are we? I mean, that kind of just doesn't feel very good. So I'll dismiss it for now, and if someone else wants to advocate for it, we can do that. I would argue that to a certain extent, if you take the choice of freezing supply, you're probably going to do that anyway eventually. You're going to make the place so ugly because only rich people can live here. I mean, I think one of the beautiful things about a place like Missoula is that, it's the bankers and the college professors and the students and the bums and the politicians, and you can find them all down at the Mo Club on Friday night. It's that mixing. I mean, that's one of the reasons I was such a strong proponent of the ball field, is because it creates that mixing. I really like that mixing. I think that mixing is what makes this such a great place to live. But if everybody has to be able to afford a $250,000 home, you can have all the mixing you want, but the people who you kind of want to have in there, they got to drive 20 or 30 miles in order to be able to mix, and so it doesn't happen anymore. And that's scary. This is also, I think that one of the real answers here is the relationship between these two. And I think the way to work with that is through design, is how you build new neighborhoods. And we have this tendency of all we want to do is build subdivisions. Or that's the way our system is set up. We may want to do something else, but our system forces us to build subdivisions. And subdivisions aren't neighborhoods. And by using design, there are lots of places in the world that have really been able to kind of crack this nut pretty well. Have been able to create high-density places that are very livable, that are nice, they're fun places to live. And it has to do with design. I mean, it has to do with things like parks. It has to do with transportation systems. It has to do with being able to go vertical and dealing with parking. All those kinds of questions. But actually, we have the ability to deal with that if we have the courage to kind of step beyond this battle here. And now we're talking about neighborhoods, but what we're really talking about here is neighbors. We're talking about the people who live right next door to the proposed densification. And that's where all the fight comes from. And somehow we have to find ways to develop a better relationship and develop some trust that allows this dynamic to work a little better. And I think there are a lot of things there. I mean, one is we are a very low density community right now. We have places of 6 dwelling units per acre, and even a few of 10 dwelling units per acre. But mostly, we have 2 dwelling units per acre, and particularly the areas that have been built since about 1960. I mean, basically, almost all we did were half-acre lots, half-acre or bigger. And as we get bigger, then we need to have more choices. And economics plays into those choices. If those big lots are really cheap, and if gasoline is really cheap, then that becomes a very desirable thing. But as gasoline becomes more expensive and as those lots become more expensive, people make choices to want to be able to live in smaller spaces, essentially not have a garden, not even have the opportunity for a garden, not have to mow grass, all those sorts of things. I mowed my lawn yesterday in the rain. It wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. So, but I guess the point I want to kind of end on that is that as we get bigger, a diversity of housing choices becomes more and more important. I mean, that's what our community wants. And what and I think we've kind of broken through this, but I think it still exists to some degree. We had this pattern of kind of the only thing the market would supply were half-acre lots. And so if you were going to live here and you were going to buy a new house, that was what you were going to get. And your only other alternative was to live in an established neighborhood where the lots were 1/4 acre or 1/8 of an acre or something less. And then that's where you could get choices. So one of the things, and it's been happening, is, and now I think most of the new development close to the urban area happens at 1/4 acre lots, 10,000 square feet. But even that is really scary for a lot of people. Yeah?
those new developments, or when you start building more dense, are those more expensive up front because they're new, or does it price out right up front, or take a while for?
The upfront capital costs are perhaps more expensive, though not necessarily. What you end up with are trade-offs, like, well, do you put sidewalks in? Because it's a lot more expensive to put sidewalks in a subdivision that has half-acre lots. I mean, it costs each lot more than in a subdivision that has, 10 dwelling units per acre.
Are there tangible savings on stuff like, I mean, obviously electricity for a smaller place, but the shorter transportation time, or maybe being closer to infrastructure?
Yeah. The built infrastructure costs you less per unit to build sewer, water, streets, and transportation, depending on where you go. Right now, Missoula, 3,000 people a day commute from the Bitterroot into Missoula to work. 3,000 people. That's quite a few. And there are about 900 to go the other direction. And that's just going to keep going. And so kind of one of the questions I think we have, we're studying the transportation corridor and we're going to spend millions to fix it. But maybe we ought to make some employment hubs down here, okay? So that we're not requiring all these people to have a job that they come up here. Anyway, I think we have some hard choices in front of us in terms of, and it comes back to the sustainability issue. We are going to run out of space if we continue at 2 dwelling units per acre here. And maybe that's what we want to do as a community. Maybe we want to use up the space so that we don't have to have this fight anymore. I don't think that's really going to be the result. I think people will keep coming. And now the fights will be even more difficult because what we'll be trying to do is retrofit neighborhoods that built out at 1 and 2 dwelling units per acre, because we know there's lots more room. And if you look at like the Central Valley in California, they have been through this fight in spades. And in fact, the state legislature, passed a law that said accessory dwelling units are legal. Doesn't matter. No matter what. Doesn't matter what the community says. They're legal. And we can't even have a conversation about accessory dwelling units in Missoula. I mean, that's the A word. And not only is it not a 4-letter, it's only a 3-letter word. We're a long ways from kind of being Palo Alto. But on the other hand, think about kind of what's happening around us. Think about, okay, we're growing at 2% a year, and we've seen these housing prices increase from $65,000 to $185,000 in a 15-year period. I think that works out to about a 7% or 8% annual increase. And think about what's happening around us. Spokane, Boise, Salt Lake City, Denver, Boulder, Bismarck. No, don't think about Bismarck. Most of those cities are growing at much more rapid rates than we are. And they have very similar characteristics. I mean, great environmental amenities, pretty good cultural amenities, and growing, diversifying economies. That's us. And those are all the things we are trying to be. We're not trying to get more ugly. We're trying to do those things because that's the kind of place we want to live in. Well, that's just going to continue to fuel this. And we're going to find ourselves, with some really hard problems. And I think, we've already found ourselves there. And that's why local politics has, become fairly, it's a very difficult discussion. It's a difficult project because you have a lot of people who don't want to see things change. So, yeah.
There's a Berkeley developer who says, and they're going through density like crazy, and he's saying you have to exchange private space for public space. So that currently, if it's a half acre, everybody has their private space, and they're all happy to have their food, they have their garden, etc. But in order to densify, you have to have public space that everybody can share, that And if people are sharing, it has to be well policed, it has to be attractive, it has to be near things, it can't be hidden away. And so, as you densify, you also have to get the public space to be complementary to that density, so you get the livability from it.
I agree, 100%. I mean, building parks, creating open spaces, or acquiring open spaces. Most of them are already created. You know, creating open space, I guess, would imply that we're going to take houses out, and that's probably more expensive than we're up for. But you know, now is our opportunity to acquire open space that's available, and we've done a reasonably good job of that. I mean, I took my dog up to the top of Mount Jumbo yesterday. You know, wow. Where else can you find something like that? You know, not very many places. Another great thing about Missoula is it has really good edges. You look at great cities around the world, they have good edges. We have, you know, Jumbo and Sentinel, and the North Hills and the South Hills. The place we don't have an edge is to the west. But if we had an edge there, then that would mean, where would we go? Well, would we go up? Well, boy, that's going to be kind of painful on the neighbor. So, Ray.
I think this is obvious. I just want to hear you talk about it. As our population increases and our prices go up, we have to have jobs for people. Therefore, presumably, that's going to grow. And I guess we also have to make decisions about where we're going to let businesses develop. I wonder if there are any statistics about acreage for business that is needed and where that's going to go.
Well, yeah. One thing is, 30 years ago, there were over 100 small grocery stores in this community. Okay? They're all over the place. I know there were, I live in the Lower Rattlesnake. There were 2 of them there. There was another one in the Middle Rattlesnake. You know, and that was the edge of town. And today, you can, on both hands, you can probably count most of the grocery stores. And we have this attitude today, and it comes from this notion of zoning that we have inherited and then evolved, is that, you know, zoning came out of the notion that you shouldn't have a major industrial facility or a pig farm right next to housing. It was a nuisance. But we still allowed all kinds of commercial uses next to residential. And we have extrapolated that original notion of zoning to the point where we don't want to mix anything. We want to have residential and commercial and industrial, way the hell over here, and agriculture someplace else. And that, I think, has really, in a lot of ways, created many problems for us. It's also fueled by the automobile, because the necessity of having local stores close by within neighborhoods was really a pedestrian type of a situation. And as we all transfer our lives to being in automobiles, you know, it's cheaper for us to kind of get the quart of milk on the way home from work at the Super Save or whatever it is. And so the little stores go out of business. And there's those economic forces created by the automobile. But I think it's been a real loss to a lot of neighborhoods that we have lost all these small stores. Now, the other thing is it's really hard to start a new small store. You know, and I'll use Rattlesnake Gardens as an example. I mean, they had a huge zoning fight, and they finally were able to overcome the protest and get a store built. And one of the things that I think would be a great project for a master's degree student in geography or planning is to go and interview all of the neighbors, and ask them what they think of the store now, and then compare those comments with those same people's comments before when we had the battle over Rattlesnake Gardens. Freddie's Feed and Read is another one I'm quite familiar with. There's another one, Peter Lambros. You know, he did get approval to put in a coffee shop on Brooks, forget the cross street, maybe Beckwith. But he had to give up so much in order to do that. And you know, in Peter you have someone who, A, has a lot of tenacity, B, he loves this community because he grew up in it, and C, probably the most important thing, he probably has the means to be able to do it. Okay? Well, if you don't have those three things, you don't get those kind of developments very, very often. And they are real assets. But we let the whole system be driven by one or two people who live next door to it, who fear total anarchy because there's going to be a coffee shop next door to them. And that's, I think, really sad. I mean, I think we are killing ourselves by allowing that kind of vehemence and that kind of protest to kill projects. And it's, maybe it's the way we're doing it. That's the main counter, is that, well, we just need to go talk to them. Talking's good, but ultimately, sometimes, people who have money invested in things, you got to go forward. You got to kind of put an end to the process and make a decision. Russ?
Yeah, I live in Ward 6, which is just to the west of Russell Street. It's been quite developed in terms of increasing the density so that there's no longer an economic way that anyone can own a yard unless they had it before this all started. But what's been done in my neighborhood, and I think that why people complain so bitterly there, is that when that question that you just described came up, there was no answer. When the people said, what's going to happen when you do this next door to me, there was no answer. There was simply increasing the density and reducing the livability and raising the price, but there was no creation of open space for that neighborhood. There are no parks there. There was no change in transportation availability. There was no change in the number of sidewalks other than scattered little, 30-foot sections.
And if we could develop a more comprehensive approach, and that's one of the things that's going on in that neighborhood now, is there is a parks and transportation infrastructure study that's going on.
Which the city people come in and say, but I know it's wonderful that you guys want all those things, but there's no money for it, so basically you can forget it.
Well, or you can pay for it.
Or you can pay for it as a neighbor.
Right, which is how most of it happens in other places.
So I'm just noticing in the dynamic here that there's a lot of taking as far as the neighborhood. And I'm arguing from the people that complain in my neighborhood. There's a lot of taking, but there's not any giving, in their view, from the city.
And I understand that tension, but I think that a lot of those people are forgetting one really important thing. That the neighborhood is zoned at very high density to begin with. And the choice that they are going to face, in many cases, is whether to have a brand new 4- or 8-plex go up next door, or if we allow some innovation and some design standards, we will have single-family residences, albeit on very small lots. And no one, of the protesters, no one seems to recognize that this is an either-or choice. It's just, no, I don't want that new development, that those new houses to happen here, and they fight it. And what happens then is, under the old zoning, the old way of doing it that we all want to get back to, you can still put in a 4-plex. And boy, look at what happened in Missoula in the 70s.
Well, it just seems like part of the solution would be learning or thinking of a new tension that could be developed within the community, so that they're not confronted with an either-or, but that they're provided with an alternative that can slowly or quickly be brought into their community, so that they're not just losing something that they value, but they're getting something's being created that they can learn to see an advantage in.
Yeah, and I think that we have done a relatively poor job of educating people about what choices are, about kind of the dynamics of change happening in neighborhoods. It's driven by economics and driven by the underlying zoning, driven by the underlying subdivision rules. And we went through this kind of grand period of growth management where we had a whole bunch of public participation, and we came up with a bunch of kind of things that we wanted to adopt. And so then we spent about 3 or 4 years trying to adopt them. And then we've been kind of back on our heels from the reaction of adopting those things. And I think that a lot of the response is not so much because of the things we adopted, it's just response because it was going to happen anyway, whether we had changed the rules or not. But what we didn't do in that time is continue that educational process. And I think that's, I mean, I fault myself as well as others, but you know, we should have been kind of playing this game on a pretty regular basis with people and creating the opportunity for people to understand the tensions and kind of the hard choices that ultimately are going to get made out here in our community. So Russ.
And I want to second what you've been saying, because I used to live in Berkeley. And it's just a perception, and it's an education of the public about the possibilities and in fact, where the world is going. I mean, you said public space, and everybody immediately thinks of green and a park or something like this. Well, in many of the developments in Berkeley, public space is the community kitchen that's within that development. So not everyone has a 500 square foot kitchen. They have a serviceable kitchen, but then there's a larger kitchen which the community can share and use at various times. There's a woodworking shop. There's not having all this redundant ability within each housing unit. It makes it a lot simpler, and I can tell you, living in those communities is quite an experience, and a lot of people like it. They talked about the size of the businesses. The world's changing. I mean, you know, the world is flat. There's two friends of mine here in Missoula. They just started a company a year ago, and this month they went over $1 million in revenue. There's just two of them working out of their bedrooms. There is a new model that's happening with business and the economy, and with how people want to live. I think we need to make people better informed about what the alternatives are, what the successes have been, and help us change our ability to see the possibilities for moving on here. I think there's a lot of great answers out there. We just have to become more aware of them.
Yeah. And I mean, you think about it in terms of our choices here. You know, we can continue to kind of exist in deadlock and gridlock and really get mad at each other and have, you know, nasty editorials in the Missoulian and that sort of thing. It sells newspapers. But if we, ultimately, a lot of these things are going to happen anyway. It's just, you know, the power of this will roll over you. Just as this line keeps marching out, demand, you know, it will flatten you. It's just going to happen. I mean, we don't have the ability in Missoula or in Montana or in the United States to close the doors. You know, they did that in
Does the city have
China.
the resources to do this education process at a neighborhood? I would imagine you'd have to do it at a pretty small ward level or less to go through this exercise.
I mean, when we were doing growth management, I think we had a budget of $100,000 a year. And I think we probably have to allocate at least that or more. And we just have to kind of acknowledge that we're going to do that year after year. But it's difficult right now because, like, you know, there has to be a level of trust in the planning department, which really doesn't exist today. So.
Are zoning rules and regulations the way that an urban growth plan sort of gets laid out or put into effect in Missoula? And are there zoning regulations that support or give incentives to different types of green building?
Well, there were some. They were kind of all on hold right now because the last city council, you know, reacted negatively towards them. Rosalie, then Sue?
You know, I think you've identified the kind of boundaries of what happens with price, density, and livability. And I think, you know, things are going to roll around between those in a fixed way. If you push on density, then you're going to push on price and livability. And when people win a victory in a particular place in town, they just push that somewhere else. So if we keep everything exactly the way it is in the middle of Missoula, we just push the problem of 25,000 houses into the county, and then it'll affect livability.
Well, I think if this is a fixed dynamic, then I think you're right. And so if that were the case, then we really ought to be thinking hard about how do we build good, brand new neighborhoods, okay? But I don't think this is fixed. And I think particularly the thing that has the most ability to change this design. If you do this well, you can actually lower the price, you can increase the density, and you can increase livability if you really do that well. But you have to spend the money, and you have to have agreement on how to do that. And you can also create more diversity. I mean, one of the big problems I think that we have now is our housing stock is largely one kind, single family detached on a pretty big lot. And we need to start finding, exposing ourselves to condominiums, to common wall, to all kinds of things like that. And really that just hasn't been very much a part of our nomenclature or our kind of economic reality. But there are people out there, and it's not for everybody. And that's the problem. As soon as you propose it, someone comes up and says, well, I don't want to live that way, so I'm against it. It's like, well, no, we're not asking you to live that way, but they might want to live that way. And we're willing to take a chance and put our money out there, and we think that they are there and will pay us to build this. I mean, that's another thing that I think is really dangerous here, is that we have, as a community, we have very little confidence in markets. We want to say, well, we're going to design it and make it happen in a particular way, and we're unwilling to recognize that kind of the way this happens, supply, new houses get built, man, that's private sector. We might build 5%, probably less than 5% of our homes come from public sector, subsidized housing. This is private sector. And we have to find ways to work with the development community. And if we just have these huge walls of distrust, with developers, boy, we're not going to get very far here. Sue, you were.
The only figures I questioned were the ones about our children going to be the ones who are going to come. What's happened to the elementary school population then? Are they all out in Clinton, and are they all going to move back when they grow up?
No, I mean, there was a huge demographic change, and I'll try to get this right. But what you had was let's see, if this is age. I'm not going to get this right.
That's all right. I flunked graphs in school anyway.
Obviously, me too. We had a huge decline in elementary age school children, and as a consequence, we closed a bunch of elementary schools. At the same time, we were growing as a community. So clearly, there's a major demographic shift going on. And if you looked out farther outside of the urban core to Hellgate or to Florence, they were growing. But they weren't growing as much as would account for all of this. So underlying all of this is a huge demographic change that's happening in the United States. People are having fewer children. Now, what happened was that decline levels off. And now it's kind of heading for the high schools. And so I think the next big, it's gone through the middle school. We closed the middle school. The next big question is, are we going to have to close a high school? But then it levels off after that. It doesn't, instead of having, 3.5 kids per family, we've decided to have, 2. But we have decided to have 2. We're not going down to 1.5 or 1, I think. I know I'm done, okay? So, Bob, you've been very patient.
One of my concerns is really long-term. I mean, sustainability in some circles would be 7 generations. And also, a lot of times, sustainability is couched as, say, population levels, but at certain consumption levels. So I could see the valley, we could have a lot more growth, but actually have a lot less impact on our natural resources, or maybe we're way beyond that population level already at a certain lifestyle. How do we get at some of those, like looking at the long-term maturity level of the growth, if there ever is one? Portland has an Office of Sustainability. We have great language in all the documents I look at for the city charter and so forth. Livable, sustainable, equitable, everyone will be taken care of, or their views heard.
A chicken in every pot, yeah.
How can that move forward in Missoula? Do we need an Office of Sustainability? Does Office of Planning and Grants fulfill that role? How can we look at some pollution at a deeper level? How does that happen in this community for the future?
Well, I think at core, your question at least partially goes back to air and water quality. And you know, I think we have made some really huge strides in those arenas. You know, if you compare air quality today with air quality in 1980, I mean, it is vastly improved. And that's with probably twice as many people as the valley as we had then. If you compare water quality with water quality in 1960, that's vastly improved too, with probably 3 or 4 times as many people in the valley. And we continue to have fights about that sort of stuff, but we have made significant progress. Now, one of the things that kind of people who want to actually stop this line is a notion of carrying capacity. The valley can only deal with this much. And the problem with that, and you see it in kind of urban development throughout the world, is that that dynamic changes. I mean, as cities grow, they're actually able to deal with more of those problems, and sometimes better, sometimes less. I mean, we have been able to grow and, I think, improve the quality of life when it comes to just those environmental issues. We have better water and we have better air. How do we keep doing that? I think that the community is really committed to those goals. The question, I think, is kind of how do we incorporate those goals into the broader thinking of how do we deal with this, with new people and with constraints over where we're going to put people. I don't, you know, at some point or another, it seems like you'd have to stop putting people here. I don't know, is that a population of 200,000? Is that a population of 1 million? 2 million? I really don't know. And you know, I guess I'm not going to I'm not going to waste my time trying to answer that one because it's so far out there. What I'd like to be able to do is look ahead 30 years or 50 years. See, I'm going to be 49 next week, so 50 years. And okay, how can we make this work in 50 years? And I think that's, I mean, I wish more people would think in those terms rather than just, you know, I've got to stop this because I don't want to have to smell cooking garlic, you know, from the restaurant next door, which I'm afraid is where a lot of our discussions in opposition rest now.
I think we're at a time.
Okay, one more question.
I just wanted to make a comment. I completely concur that design is the integral connection here between the perceived livability and density and making it workable for everybody. And we have 4 wonderful housing projects that Homeward have done right here in Missoula that are green buildings, show alternative living, different ways of people to function in small spaces together. They're aesthetic, they're built with green principles, and interestingly enough, they're low income. And I think that that would be a key educational component for people to go spend time seeing the Lenox Building or the Orchard Groves or Gold Dust and taking a look at how this is actually already functioning in our community.
I agree. We have to create examples. One of the key things that we have to do, though, is we have to take those kinds of projects out of the public sector and get the private sector excited about making that happen.
Right.
And
I
seeing that they can
understand the
make money
condition,
doing it.
but my point being they're so aesthetically beautiful and the people there are so happy to be there.
Well, the people who are there, but remember there are a lot of people who aren't there who really see them as too much density, too many young screaming kids, ... You know, so well, the people who live there think it's great. I mean, the people who live out at the new development next to the airport, they think it's great. They can't sell those homes fast enough. But people drive by on the interstate and say, God, I'd never live like that, you know, rats scurrying around, bumping into each other all the time. And we have to deal with that perception. So, on that exciting note, I'll quit.